Hi, welcome back to History 3380, World Civilizations. This is the second half of Session 11. In the first half, what we've been looking at is the development of the United States in terms of its self-conceived mission to the world, because the United States became the principal promoter of modernization, westernization during the 20th century and on into the current century. And we've looked at that mission evolve from a religious mission, although religious issues remain significant in the American mission down through the centuries, but it also took on aspects of a political mission as Americans tried to convince other societies, particularly in the Western Hemisphere initially, of the soundness of their republican political institutions. By the middle of the 19th century, it had taken on aspects of territorial expansion as Americans came to believe that they were a superior race and that it was their obligation, essentially, to reach out and seize vast territories, including much of modern-day Mexico. That kind of mission, however, subsided, and by the beginning of the 20th century, the United States was engaged in what it termed a civilizing mission, to bring the various elements of what it saw as its own civilization to other societies. And again, most of this is confined to the Western Hemisphere. But the idea of going in and occupying places like Cuba and the Dominican Republic and transforming these societies with public works, with American capital investment, American attempts to reform education and other areas of government, all of this became part of this civilizing mission. However, it also managed to trigger significant responses and often negative reactions in places like Mexico and Cuba. And during the Great Depression, the United States, cognizant of these problems, but also faced with its own massive crisis because of the Great Depression, managed to evolve a new consensus that included the Democratic Party, high-tech industries, and labor, a group which agreed on the need to create a social safety net in the United States for working people, and also the idea that both the federal government and corporations would take a major role in reopening the international economy, largely closed down by the Depression. And all of this, of course, would benefit these high-tech corporations. As we got to the end of the first half of this session, I was talking about World War II and the contrast between what the Americans conceived of as what the world should look like and what other institutions, political institutions, and countries in the world conceived of as that future. And if we go to the first slide here, this is the last one that I was talking about, which is, as of World War II, we're talking about economies of control, such as in Nazi Germany, communist Russia, where the idea was that the state would control what were conceived to be limited assets and distribute them to people more equitably in the case of the Soviet Union, but nevertheless, in both cases, there would be state control and redistribution. The American idea was very different, that the state should have a minimal role in the economic process, and that free market, laissez-faire economics should dominate. And these two visions obviously looked at the world in different ways. The state-controlled ideas of the Soviet Union thought in terms of economic limitation. The American idea was that its system could produce endless abundance of material goods and therefore create prosperity throughout society. And that, well, communism would offer a workers' paradise with guaranteed jobs and education and housing. The American system would offer a consumer's paradise where people would be free to choose from a cornucopia of consumer goods. These were the two contrasting visions that would predominate through much of the second half of the 20th century in the world, and the United States and the Soviet Union would contest each other's visions of the future across the globe during much of the second half of the 20th century. Now, in the aftermath of World War II, the United States went out with a foreign policy that was very much a product of this political alliance at home. The idea of productivity was key to what the United States would try to accomplish around the world. Americans believed that by taking their capital, their technology to various parts of the world, they could achieve economic prosperity in a variety of social and economic settings. It didn't just have to be the Western Hemisphere, it could be Asia, Africa, anywhere. And that by doing this, they would create such wealth that a trickle-down effect would bring the benefits of this new prosperity to all levels of society. Essentially, this was the same idea that lay behind the domestic alliance among the government and big business and labor. That you didn't have to radically reshape the social and economic order. You didn't need a communist revolution. All you needed was to let American technology and American productivity generate enormous new wells of wealth which people could then access. And this would avoid the necessity for a violent revolution to reshape society's economic, social, and political institutions. The Americans got to experiment with this idea right after the war because the economies and political institutions of both Germany and Japan had been destroyed. There was little left of either of these economies, and certainly nothing left of the political institutions that had dominated them for decades. So the United States would go in to Germany, and also to Europe in general, because much of Europe had been destroyed by the war, and seek to rebuild under what was known as the Marshall Plan. Japan would be occupied by the United States, and there too, the Americans would seek to rebuild the economy and political institutions. Drafting a new constitution in Japan, but also infusing American capital and technology into these societies to help restore economic development and growth. Societies that would now, it was assumed, become our allies in the emerging conflict with the Soviet Union. And these efforts were apparently quite successful because both Germany and Japan rebounded rapidly in the decade after the end of the war and became significant forces in the world economy within 10 or 15 years after these same economies had been decimated by the war. Americans took from this, American policymakers took from this the idea that, well, they could spread these same technologies, institutions around the globe, assuming that there would be the same kind of success, and that once again, they would not have to radically alter the societies in which these activities took place. Now, this didn't take account of the fact that Germany and Japan had already been highly developed capitalist economies. It wasn't as if, despite the destruction of the war, they were starting from scratch. They still had a significant trained labor force. They still had a number of entrepreneurs, some of whom the Americans let out of jail, such as in Germany. They were convicted war criminals, but they were needed to get the economy going. So there were a number of institutions already in existence, despite the destruction of the war, that helped this rebuilding process. And the Americans would find that the same effort was not necessarily rewarded with the same results when they went to other parts of the world that had not already experienced significant levels of economic development. But nonetheless, the Americans remained confident in their solution. And it wasn't just the U.S. government or U.S. corporations that were trying to do this. Early in the 20th century, a series of private foundations had been created in the United States, usually by leading capitalists like Rockefeller. These institutions, these private foundations, had a number of purposes in mind. One thing was helpful is that the income tax was being introduced, and it was a great way to save on your taxes. Just in case you haven't finished your taxes yet. You might go out and set up a foundation and dump a lot of money in it tonight. That money is essentially treated as if it were an IRA, that you can put this money in there and avoid taxes on it. So it was beneficial in that way. But it was also driven by the idea of many of these people, such as Rockefeller, that they needed to carry out a religious mission. They had been influenced by the missionary efforts, Protestant missionaries who had gone to such far-flung places as China, but also more locally into places like Mexico, to try to convert people to Christianity. And as a part of that same process, they had believed that it was important that they help improve social conditions in the countries where they worked. So institutions like the Rockefeller Foundation reflected, in part, the same missionary mentality, and the idea of social and economic reform became a part of their projects, including such enterprises engaged in overseas. One of the most famous involved the Rockefeller Foundation in Mexico. At the time of World War II, the Rockefeller Foundation went in with the idea of vastly improving productivity in agriculture. And here was a classic example of how Americans saw the future and what they could do in the world around them. They would bring technologies, hybrid seeds, in other words, seeds that have been specially developed to be highly productive, produce a lot of grain, and to be resistant to disease, and combined these new, hardier seeds and more productive seeds with infusions of fertilizer. The end result was a tremendous leap in agricultural productivity, a lot more product being produced on the same amount of land. Now, one problem that arose with this was that this enterprise, as much as it was meant to be simply this installation of technology that would bring development, it had side effects. It wasn't neutral. It worked much better for wheat farmers than for corn farmers. The distinction was largely this, that wheat farmers in Mexico tended to be commercial farmers. They had medium to large properties. They were already engaged in commercial production. Corn farmers, on the other hand, tended to be peasants with few resources available to them. The Rockefeller project favored the wheat farmers because they already had some of the basic technologies, market connections that could benefit most easily from this enterprise. Corn farmers, on the other hand, were peasants who still ran basically peasant economies, growing some corn but also some other products to balance those off in case there was a drought affecting one crop versus another. And they had very little in the way of economic resources and certainly no market connections. So rarely would these people pick up on the ideas, the reforms introduced by the Rockefeller Foundation. And as a result, it was the wheat farmers who benefited the most, creating disparities in wealth in the countryside. This project took on much larger form by the 1950s and 60s and became known as the Green Revolution, and would spread not just to wheat and to corn, but to rice. New hybrid forms of rice being introduced in Southeast Asia and throughout the region that vastly improved food production for people in the societies affected. But again, these seemingly neutral technologies and programs designed to bring development had consequences. There were winners and losers. Those people most able to engage in commercial production of agricultural products were the ones who benefited most heavily from these enterprises. So it certainly had the effect that the Rockefellers were looking for and that American government planners were looking for, by vastly expanding agricultural production, helping to ease problems of hunger, helping to pave the way for industrialization, because now food would be available at relatively low prices for industrial workers. All of that was true, but it also had a side effect of creating disparities of wealth in the countryside between those who could afford to engage in these new developments and those who did not have the means to do so. By the 1950s, when the Rockefeller program, the Green Revolution, was beginning to spread to distant parts of the globe, American intellectuals, American policymakers, people who worked in foundations, began to coalesce in a set of ideas that came to represent the American mission for the next several decades. And these ideas were expressed by the economist Walt W. Rostow in his book, The Stages of Economic Growth. Basically, what Rostow argued in his book was that all societies go through a series of stages of economic development that eventually lead them to the stage of modern capitalist economic development. And he laid out those stages and the point at which economies reach self-sustaining growth, the takeoff stage. This idea was essentially what was termed modernization theory. It was meant to explain not only how places like the United States and Europe and Japan had achieved economic development. It was also meant to lay out a roadmap for how other societies, whether in Latin America or Asia or Africa, or etc., could achieve that same development. Modernization theory argued that essentially there are two kinds of cultures, traditional and modern. Traditional cultures, as the name implies, tended to rely on tradition, meaning we do things a certain way because that's the way we've always done them. You know, we always wait for the local religious figure, the shaman, to bless our fields at this particular day because that's our tradition. Not because we have any scientific proof that we get more crops by doing it on this day with this blessing, but because we've always done it that way. Modern cultures, according to this theory, on the other hand, are rationalist. In a modern culture, farmers say, well, I'm going to plant my crops on this date because I've looked at the weather forecasts for the next few weeks, and they tell me that there's a good period of rain coming over the next few weeks, so obviously this date is the best date to do it because rain will then come and I'll get the best crop. But that's a rational decision, and that's based on factual information that the farmer has obtained. Traditional societies rely on communal action. In other words, they tend to work as a group. Think back to early in the course when we talked about patronage, lineage groups, clans, kin groups. That's the kind of thing this is referring to. And that these tend to be hierarchical. In other words, there tends to be somebody who runs the show, and these systems tend to be self-perpetuating. And according to modernization theory, they tend to discourage individual initiative. You know, we do what the chief says. We do what the clan leader says. That's why we do these things. And we do them together as a group. Discouraging the individualism, which is at the heart of modern cultures. In a modern culture, people are competitive, individualistic, and that's why we have the kinds of modern productive economies, because people are going out and trying to improve themselves individually, competing with others, and all of this leads to greater productive output for the economy and society. In a contemporary observation, the other contrast is between a future based on the capitalist model versus a future based on communism. So if we have contrast between modern and traditional societies, we also have a contrast for what the future holds. One possibility is capitalist development, which of course Rostow is promoting, as opposed to communism. In fact, the subtitle of his book is An Anti-Communist Manifesto. So he means this not only to explain why are some societies underdeveloped and others developed, he also wants to lay out the future that obviously in his mind capitalist development would be much better than communist development. Furthermore, in explaining all of this, Rostow says that, well, this is how societies develop. And people like he would look at Europe England, study the kinds of things that we looked at before, such as the English Civil War, the enclosure movement, the rise of industrialization, and say, well, that's the process by which a modern society emerges with a modern capitalist economy. Now, that happened, shall we say, by chance, but it doesn't have to be that way. All these traditional societies in Latin America and Africa and Asia, they can move over that same course, but much more rapidly than Western societies have done, because we can promote capitalist development. We can help push them through the stages of economic growth that simply came naturally, shall we say, in Western societies in centuries past. So the idea here was to promote the fact that the United States could go in and, through its efforts, and through the efforts of not just government, but corporations, foundations, we could accelerate the process by which countries move from being traditional cultures to being modern cultures and having modern economic systems. Now, in many ways, this moved the American mission away from ideas of trying to civilize people from inferior races. Because now the argument was, well, it's not that you're racially inferior. It's that your culture is inferior. It's a traditional culture. And that's changeable. We can help you change it. We can help you create a rational, individualistic, capitalistic society and economy through our aid programs, through American investment, etc. And by the 1950s, there was clear evidence of Americans trying to do precisely that, and evidence that this was not an isolated policy on the part of the government or on the part of foundations, etc., but there was a close interaction between people promoting this idea of modernizing the rest of the globe. One striking example comes with Nelson Rockefeller. Nelson Rockefeller was the grandson of John D. Rockefeller. John D., of course, having created Standard Oil, one of the wealthiest men ever in America, and, of course, the founder of the Rockefeller Foundation. Nelson Rockefeller spent much of his life in government, especially in the federal government administering programs dealing with Latin America, but more generally addressing issues of development. He was also quite familiar with the workings of the Rockefeller Foundation and sought to bring many of the ideas of the Rockefeller Foundation into the federal government. And one way that happened was through people. One of them was a man named Albion Patterson. Albion Patterson was a specialist in agrarian development who had worked for the Rockefeller Foundation, who had helped promote the ideas of the Green Revolution. But by the 1950s, the mid-1950s, he had moved from the Rockefeller Foundation into the federal government. And he brought those same ideas along with him. And he was placed in charge of promoting agrarian reform in Chile. And what Albion Patterson tries to do is very much like what the Rockefeller Foundation tried to do with the Green Revolution. He went in and sought to promote capitalist, commercial, agricultural development in southern Chile. He quite explicitly said that, we're not here to help the down and outers. We're here to help those people who are most capable of absorbing these lessons, of using new seed, using new technologies to improve output. And by doing that, helping Chile industrialize by providing relatively inexpensive foodstuffs. But along the way, Patterson also realized that one of the obstacles to carrying out such U.S. government programs designed to promote economic development was the lack of trained technocrats in countries like Chile and indeed throughout the underdeveloped world. None of these projects could possibly transform an entire economy or even a sector of it like agriculture by themselves. They were meant to help start a process in which these countries would modernize, having been given some of the basic tools. But Patterson concluded that the problem with this idea of transferring these technologies and ideas was a lack of trained professionals in these countries. People like economists, sociologists, public planners, engineers, that these were the technocrats who were needed to take these ideas and infusions of technology the Americans could provide and expand them and spread them throughout their societies. Patterson became convinced of the importance of education to train professionals in developing countries. And he found an ideal opportunity to pursue this idea at the Catholic University of Chile in the 1950s. And in fact, his enterprise, his project, would reflect again this merger of multiple interests in the United States. His idea brought together the Rockefeller Foundation, the federal government, both of which helped provide funding, and the University of Chicago, which, by the way, was founded with Rockefeller money. The project was to train a generation of young economists. These young men would be sent off to the University of Chicago for graduate training in economics to get master's degrees and PhDs. And they would be trained in the classic or neoclassical form of economics, the idea of free enterprise. At the University of Chicago were some of the leading minds in neoclassical liberalism, meaning people who wanted to get back to the free market, who felt that there was too much government control, even in the United States, for economies to flourish. So they wanted to restore what they believed were the dynamics of free market economic systems that existed back in the 19th and early 20th century before the Great Depression. Among them was, of course, Milton Friedman, one of the most famous economists in the United States in the 20th century. Now, these young men who were trained for that reason became known as the Chicago Boys, because they'd all gone to the University of Chicago. And they came back, and essentially they formed the new Department of Economics at the Catholic University. Here, a group, just over 70 economists had been trained, who were now going to go back to their own country and promote these ideas of free enterprise development. We'll see down the road the significance of all of this, but it's another indication of not only did a variety of American institutions and interests come together, Rockefeller Foundation, federal government, University of Chicago, but also that this program was far broader than just corporate investment or the government providing technologies. Here they were also going to train people, and this was just part of the project. Tens of thousands of people in third world countries would be sent to the United States to be educated and to learn the American system, American political institutions, American economic institutions. And then they would go back, of course, to their home countries. And given the fact that they bore degrees from major American universities, they were likely to enter into senior positions in their governments over the next several decades. And not only were tens of thousands sent to the United States for training, even more were trained in their home countries in programs which the federal government and the various private foundations like Rockefeller and Ford were promoting. So a whole generation of technocrats in countries around the world, from the Middle East to Africa to Asia to Latin America, were being trained in American principles of development, whether it was economic development, social development, political institutions, etc. Now, while all this is going on, not everyone agreed with this approach. The American civilizing mission had as its jewel in the crown the island nation of Cuba. That's, of course, where the Americans had gone early in the 20th century, right at the turn of the century, and had reformed education, massive U.S. investment, and where they had faced rebellion in 1933. Issues such as reaction against American economic domination, reaction to problems of poverty within Cuba, kept Cuban society and Cuban politics in turmoil even after the revolution of 1933 was ended. Cuba helped illustrate the problem that the Americans were going to encounter time and again, and that was that, well, yes, they could go in and with their technologies increase production and things like sugar and speed up economic growth. They weren't going to radically transform political and social systems, which often meant that the benefits of such growth were unevenly distributed, to say the least, within society. Fidel Castro, whose insurgents took control of Cuba at the beginning of 1959, led a revolution that rejected the American mission wholesale. The Cuban Revolution nationalized $1 billion of U.S. investment. Relations between the United States and Cuba effectively came to an end. Castro began a radical redistribution of wealth in Cuba, breaking up land, turning it over to peasants, creating workers' federations to control the industrial process. It was essentially a total rejection of the U.S. and was symbolized by his growing closeness to the Soviet Union. So here was a place where the United States civilizing mission had expended enormous energies, and yet now it was the country in the Western Hemisphere that was unalterably opposed to the United States and its mission. In response to this threat and this challenge, the U.S. government took modernization theory and made it a formal policy called the Alliance for Progress. The Alliance for Progress was the ultimate expression of modernization theory. The U.S. would invest about $20 billion, the U.S. government, in promoting improved agricultural development, improved mining and manufacturing, and at the same time would try to compel reforms in the social and political area, in the sort of carrot and stick approach, saying that, well, countries that want to participate in this program, this Alliance for Progress, who want to gain access to these resources, have to show signs of reform. But again, ultimately, the vision was to create significant economic change without radical revolution. In fact, the American concern was far more with avoiding revolutions than it was with creating more equitable social systems, much as in the past the United States still believed that, look, we can offer technological solutions. We don't have to go scrambling up the social and political order, taking the wealth of the rich away from them. We don't have to do that kind of thing. We'll simply make the system more efficient, more productive, and then everyone will benefit. Again, these ideas don't necessarily meet the interests of people in the developing world, in places like Latin America and Asia, etc. Many of the leaders of newly independent countries in Africa, leaders of some Latin American countries and some in Asia, such as Indonesia, India, proposed what they called a third way, meaning something that wasn't capitalism, but neither was it communism. This is where the term third world started coming from those societies that said, look, we're not communists, we're not capitalists, we want something that's not either. It's in between. Part of this third way was an analysis of the status of countries around the world that still suffered from economic underdevelopment. And that would be most of Latin America, Africa, Asia, and much of the Middle East. This analysis, called dependency theory, which originated in Latin America, argued that the reason for underdevelopment in all these different parts of the world was because of the domination by these regions, the domination of these regions by Western societies. Whether we're talking European imperialism of the 19th and first half of the 20th century, or if we're talking about American dominance economically, especially in the Western Hemisphere, dependency theory said that's the problem. That's why we're underdeveloped, because you see, these colonial powers shaped our economies to depend only on primary goods exports, such as in Africa. And even when it wasn't straight colonialism, such as in the Western Hemisphere, they drained our countries of capital. Yes, they came in and invested, but they took their wealth back with them and left little behind for us. So that's why we're underdeveloped, because our economies have been distorted in how they grew, they're not ready to industrialize, and because the Westerners, whether it's the United States, England, Germany, France, they took so much of our wealth that we don't have the resources to promote development. So dependency theory was a devastating critique of the past in these countries and the role of the West in their development or underdevelopment. Those who ascribed to this idea usually also ascribed to a future based on socialism, meaning that governments would take a much larger role in the economic and social order and would seek to redistribute wealth. That might mean improved public education, systems of social security, other forms of welfare. It might mean outright grants of money to the indigent, housing projects for the poor, etc., etc. So much of the world, outside of Europe, the United States, Japan, and of course would really exclude the Soviet Union and China because they were following a different course of outright communism with total state control of the economic and social order. Most of the world, outside of the communist world and the capitalist world, in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, was pursuing a course more or less based on these ideas. One of the principal economic policies that came out of this was what was called import substituting industrialization, which is a very long term for protectionism. And what it means is that believing that foreign investors had in the past taken much of the wealth from these economies, many countries began pursuing protectionist policies, building tariff barriers. In other words, saying that, well, if you want to import your goods into our country, you're going to have to pay a tariff or an import tax of, let us say, 100%, 200% on the value of the product. In other words, we're going to raise the import duties or taxes to a prohibitive level where it would be very hard for you to actually ship your goods to us. That will create, along with government expenditures, opportunities for domestic industrialization. The government will go out and encourage private investors, or the government will itself take on economic projects like building power plants and steel mills. So we will industrialize through a conscious effort led by the government and designed to exclude foreign imports. So while the Americans are promoting the ideas of modernization theory, and the U.S. government through the Alliance for Progress and the Rockefeller and Ford Foundations and others are all engaged in this effort to promote this vision of the future, they're also coming up against alternative forces that say, no, no, more involvement from the West, from the developed world, is just what we don't need. Instead, we need to basically isolate you. Now, this was not universal. Does not mean that they didn't want any foreign investment, but if there was going to be foreign investment, it had to be closely controlled by the local government. Faced with these kinds of challenges, such as Castro's revolution, such as ideas promoted by dependency theorists, the U.S. became adamant about crushing these challenges. The Alliance for Progress came to focus more on trying to prevent alternative strategies than it did on promoting the American idea of how to modernize, how to move societies from traditionalism into the modern age. As a result, the United States in 1964 helped promote a military coup that overthrew the government there. And in 1973, the U.S. again helped promote a military coup that overthrew the government of Chile. Why? Because both of these countries were seen as pursuing policies that were hostile to the American mission. Chile, in particular, had a socialist government. It was pursuing just the kinds of policies that I mentioned a moment ago in terms of excluding foreign investment, massive nationalizations of foreign investment, redistributing wealth, trying to promote a socialist economic and social system. So the United States became very hostile to these alternatives, even if the alternative wasn't outright communism, as it was in Cuba. Even other alternatives, such as socialism, which much of the developing world was pursuing, was seen as hostile and the types of projects and alternatives that had to be frustrated. That same set of ideas came to the forefront in Vietnam in the 1960s. Vietnam, by the 1960s, was divided between the North and the South. The North was communist, the South was a government supported by the United States. Americans were concerned not only with the overall threat of communism, they were also concerned with the fact that Japan's continued development, something which the United States had expended a good deal of resources on after World War II, would be threatened if other economies in Asia were closed off to it. China had gone communist in 1950. The biggest potential market that Japan had was largely closed off to it now. If it also lost countries in Southeast Asia like Vietnam, the damage would be even more significant. Therefore, the United States became convinced that it had to save the South, it had to prevent the communists in the North from taking over in the South. What that meant was that modernization theorists were given yet another opportunity to try to prove what they could do. South Vietnam became another laboratory in which they could experiment. It wasn't just a matter of fighting a war. It was a matter of creating a government. It was a matter of creating a modern economy, modern social institutions, the whole 9 yards of modernization projects would be brought to bear in Vietnam, in South Vietnam, during the 1960s. But eventually, by 1975, the United States faced another failure. Much like in Cuba, where the civilizing mission had been rejected. Now, with the collapse of South Vietnam and the communist takeover, the modernizing mission seemed to have been absolutely rejected as well. From the view of Washington policymakers, the 1970s seemed to be suggesting that America's effort to spread its influence around the globe, its version of an empire, which had little to do with territorial acquisition, as I mentioned before, very much unlike the European experience of the 19th and first part of the 20th centuries. But the idea that the U.S. would spread its ideas, its political institutions, its economic system, and opportunities for its corporations to invest seemed to have been rejected in telling fashion with the Cuban Revolution in 1959 and then the success of the Vietnamese communists by 1975. The United States appeared to have faced, particularly in Vietnam, significant military defeat. And the world seemed more divided than ever between the options of capitalism and the options of communism. Most people who looked at international developments in the mid-1970s would take a very dark view of what the future might hold for the United States and its mission to the world. It had gone on losing developing countries to communism, not only Eastern Europe after World War II, particularly in the 1950s, but then Cuba, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, the list seemed to go on. China, of course, 1950. It seemed like communism was spreading, and that Vietnam was just the latest example of the fact that the United States had reached the limits of its power. And in some ways, that may have been true, particularly in the sense of its military power. Vietnam helped illustrate the limits that, for even the United States, of actually using its military force in a significant way in far-flung parts of the world. But that didn't mean that the United States didn't have other options. Ultimately, the power of the United States, as much as it has been backed up by military force in terms of spreading its ideas, had less to do with military conquest and technologies than it did with the power of American economic institutions and the power of American ideas. Indeed, in promoting its mission after World War II, first in helping Germany and Japan to recover, then in modernization theory and the Alliance for Progress and projects in Vietnam, etc., the United States hadn't simply gone out on its own and tried to change the whole world. The United States had created a series of multilateral institutions to try to influence the long-term economic development of the world, to create conditions that we now refer to as globalization. Among those institutions was the International Monetary Fund. The IMF, or International Monetary Fund, was a multilateral institution designed to assist countries who were having financial problems, particularly countries who would have foreign debt problems, countries that became indebted to foreign bankers and found themselves having problems repaying those loans. This had happened during the Great Depression, and there really was no effective multilateral institution to deal with the problems of countries that owed large amounts of money. The IMF was designed to intervene and offer solutions. However, those solutions came at a price. The IMF simply would not go in and say, well, you've gotten yourself into a bit of a problem here, you owe billions of dollars, and you can't pay it back, so we'll loan you the money while your economy recovers to help pay your debts. No. The IMF would help. It would help in making payments, in arranging extensions on the loans that were owed, but it did so at a price. The IMF had an agenda. And that agenda was, look, if we're going to do this for you, you have to do certain things. You have to open your country up to more foreign investment. You have to lower trade barriers, because those kinds of things, foreign investment and open trade, will help generate the foreign currency you need to pay your debts. The simple problem is this. When a country borrows money, the way it pays it back is essentially by selling its exports overseas. And ideally, or simplistically maybe, the difference between what a country sells overseas and what it imports leaves it with the money that it needs to pay its debts. In other words, if I export $10 billion but import $8 billion, then I have $2 billion to pay my foreign debts with, theoretically. So what the IMF is saying, look, you need to be exporting more goods, because if you export $12 billion and only import 8, now you've got $4 billion to pay your debts. So countries had to open themselves up, relax trade restrictions, allow more foreign investment. Not surprisingly, these were precisely the kinds of principles that the United States was promoting. The United States helped create the IMF. The World Bank was a similar institution in the sense it was a multilateral institution. Its members consist of particularly the leading industrialized countries of the world, like the United States and Germany and Japan and France and England, etc. And its mission is to promote development projects around the world. It might mean building roads, power plants, etc., irrigation programs, programs to develop certain kinds of industries. But just like the IMF, the World Bank just doesn't go out and say, oh, here, have some money, yeah, take on a project. A country has to come forward with a proposal that they want to do X, Y, or Z. And we want to provide farm equipment for 50,000 peasants and training on how to use it to improve industrial or agricultural productivity. Okay, but that project has to promote private enterprise. If you come and say, oh, we have a collective farm, see, we believe we're socialists, so we have a collective farm and we want to improve the productivity of the collective farm, the World Bank would say, gee, that sounds like something nice, but don't look at us to fund it, because that's not capitalist. That's not private enterprise. That's encouraging socialistic approaches. So the World Bank as well has an agenda. It isn't just, oh, we go out and help countries develop. Yes, but they have to be following certain economic policies, which not surprisingly, again, since every president of the World Bank, right down to today, has been an American, it's not surprising that those policies tend to reflect the mission of the United States as the United States defines that mission, which is opening up the world's economies to foreign investment and to trade. Now, the United States has this considerable influence because increasingly it came to be the dominant world power. Up until the end of the 1980s, people would argue that, of course, there was a major competition going on between the United States and the Soviet Union. But it's also true that when you look at the comparative size of the two economies, their productivity, and their overall military strength, it was also clear that the United States was far more the major power than was the Soviet Union. And in 1989, the Soviet Union collapsed, and there was no longer any question. There was only one world power. That domination, both economically and militarily, helped the United States deal with the fact that as the decades passed, it wasn't just the Soviet Union it was competing with anymore. Europe had rebuilt, and now it wasn't a matter of helping the Europeans. The Europeans had created their own European Union, the EU, which was designed to integrate the various economies of Europe. and made Europe a very powerful economic engine in its own right. Japan, of course, was rapidly surging forward as a leading industrial power. And then by the 1980s and 90s, China emerged as a major economic power as well. So the United States faces those challenges as well, but it's able to use its position as the world's leading economic force and its leading military force to help maintain its position in the world. For example, it tries to discourage regional trading blocs, not that it's done that with total success, but it tries to keep the world's economy open. What the United States doesn't want to see, besides protectionism in developing countries, is various areas of the world, whether it's Europe or Asia, breaking off into their own trade blocs that would prevent the United States from trading effectively and investing effectively there. So again, it isn't just in the developing world that the United States is concerned with promoting its mission. It also has to do with developed countries like Japan, China, and all of Europe, that we don't want to see these areas close themselves off into regional trading blocs either. Among the most powerful weapons that the United States has had in spreading its mission has been the idea of consumerism. We talked a little bit about the emergence of consumerism by the early 20th century in the United States, and the idea of the consumer ideal. First of all, consumerism has proven to be a powerful economic phenomenon because it so vastly expands markets. If we look at, let us say, the early 19th century in most countries, internal markets weren't very big. Most people, even people who lived in cities, had very limited demands. Yeah, well, yeah, I got to buy a frying pan, and, you know, I'll buy a few basic foods. The other stuff I'll grow in the backyard. I'm probably still making most of my own clothes. Internal markets, even in developing, industrialized countries like England, weren't that big, because the internal market, in terms of the overall population, even when people were turning towards commercial farming and had money to spend, even then, most of what people bought were subsistence goods. So even industrialization by itself didn't create a vast internal market. Even in the United States, where almost everybody was in the market economy because people were either earning wages or they were developing commercial agricultural properties, so they had money to spend and could buy things. Even here, the internal market wasn't that big because people bought necessities. What do I need in terms of fertilizer, tools, a few basic instruments for building my own home? But with the coming of consumerism at the beginning of the 20th century, you vastly expand that possibility. Because now I'm going to buy stuff that I don't need. That's the whole idea of consumerism. That's what makes it different from all the periods of past human history. Only a tiny fragment of the human population, if we go back to the early modern world that we talked about at the beginning of the course, only a tiny fragment, 0.1% of the population, could engage in non-necessary consumption. You're a king, queen, a nobleman, etc. Okay, you can have jewelry made for you and ornate costumes, etc., that you don't really need, but it helps show off your power, etc. But that's a tiny, tiny percentage of the human population, 0.1 of 1%. But what if 60 or 70% of the human population could engage in consumption that wasn't necessary? There's a vast increase. And what if 100%, which we may be approaching now, of the human population could engage in non-necessary consumption? Just stuff that I want. This creates an enormous increase in economic demand and therefore enormous new opportunities for economic growth. And that's what consumerism did. And it did it, again, by linking the ideas of human fulfillment to the consumption of material goods and services. That this process will make you happy, will make you feel fulfilled. Until you're wearing these kinds of clothes, have this kind of lipstick, or get this procedure done on your body, liposuction or LASIK surgery. Until then, you can't really be happy. Okay? When people buy into that idea, and we all have to some degree or other, no matter how conscious we may be of it, you create vast opportunities for economic growth because you create vast increases in consumption. And you also create something else, and that is a new way of people defining themselves, what their identity is. Now, identities, most people have multiple identities. We don't think of ourselves as just one thing. I'm a male, I'm a female, I'm a citizen of the United States, I'm a member of this church. We all have multiple identities. But a new identity, one that can be shaped and reshaped constantly, is something that consumerism offers you the opportunity to create. Now, whether it replaces all of those other identities is a matter of debate, even today. But suddenly, I can be something other than I am or was. If I have the wrong mental attitude, I'll go to a psychotherapist. I'll go to the gym and exercise and change my body. I'll dye my hair. If I want a child, I'll have somebody else have it for me. If I can't have it myself, what's the problem? I can remake myself psychologically, physically, relationship-wise. I mean, think of your daily exposure to culture and how often what you're being offered is something that supposedly will change you. 10 tips on how to get a date. None of which you find out work. But still, it's a chance to change yourself. Suddenly you're not the shy, innocuous little person. Suddenly you have the gift of gab and incredible social skills because you bought this book, of course. Always costs something. We have a chance to redefine ourselves and reinvent our identities on a regular basis. These were powerful ideas that the American mission helped to spread in the second half of the 20th century. Now, initially, the impact of consumerism globally, because most societies as of the 1950s and 60s were well behind the United States in becoming consumer societies, initially, it's fairly limited, sort of an elite consumer economy. Goods like whiskey and watches. Watches were at one time considered, elite items for purchase because you had to have a Swiss movement in the watch. Now all you need is, of course, a battery. So products of this nature, luxury vehicles, these kinds of things that a small part of the population, wasn't just members of the nobility anymore, but well-to-do people or upper middle class people could purchase these goods, and these goods were beginning to circulate internationally. But still, the vast majority of citizens in countries around the world still had only limited exposure to what we would call consumer culture, particularly if we exclude places like England and France. Germany, again, sort of was entering the consumer age, but even there, the idea of being absorbed in the purchase of goods and services had not fully caught on in these decades. But this was the beginning of a new American penetration, despite the military frustrations that would come in places like Vietnam. This sort of irresistible empire, an influence that went beyond mere economic statistics or military statistics. Irresistible in the sense that the United States aside from all its projects of modernization and civilizing empire, the idea of consumerism was the most powerful idea that the United States brought to the world, and that has had enormous impact on the process of globalization. The idea that people would readily embrace in the second half of the 20th century, and progressively so as the decades wore on, this idea that by the end of the 20th century, Nike sneakers could be found anywhere from the Himalayas to the southern tip of southern Africa. The idea that more and more of the world's population was being drawn into this basic principle that the consumption of material goods and services provided an excellent path to human happiness and contentment. Obviously, a radical alternative to the ideas of limited economies promoted by fascists and later, well, at the same time really, and down late into the 20th century by communism. If there was one thing that helped swing the balance away from communism and towards capitalism in the second half of the 20th century, it was the irresistible appeal of consumer societies and of the idea of individual liberty, if defined in no other way than defined by the ability of the individual to consume products as they chose. So even in the face of dire circumstances, with the Cuban Revolution challenging the U.S. in its Western Hemisphere and defeat in Vietnam, this even more powerful aspect of American culture, of consumerism, was beginning to spread through the world. And eventually, it would help undermine communism and would set the stage for what we now see as the modern global economy. It was the ultimate phase of the American mission. An American mission rooted in the idea of spreading Reformed Christianity to the world, of spreading American political institutions, Republican representative forms of government. Later, the idea that whether it was Christianity or political institutions or economic institutions, they could be most successfully spread by territorial expansion, justified by the belief of many Americans that they represented a superior race, at least temporarily came to represent this mission. By the beginning of the 20th century, Americans have forsaken territorial expansion. They will no longer seek to acquire vast territories. The United States will never become one of the major colonial powers, as were the European states. And instead, a focus on spreading American markets, American trade, and American investment. And along the way, using these opportunities to civilize societies that Americans still saw as racially inferior, to bring honest, stern American government, American business enterprise with its rationality, to reform education, promote individualism. The Great Depression, of course, creates an enormous challenge because it threatens the basic underpinnings of capitalist development around the world. But the United States responds with this new alliance that comes to focus on ideas of productivity and policies designed to bring modernity by the 1950s and 60s. This idea, shared by corporate planners and the heads of private foundations, political leaders, focused on the idea that the United States could bring technological change around the globe, best encapsulated by the Alliance for Progress. And by doing so, the United States would not have to engage in or face the risk of revolutionary change, Rather, societies could modernize, wealth could be generated through American influence that would spread throughout social systems. Now, the reality is, as the United States discovered by the 1970s, was that in many of these countries, that trickle down was never going to happen. By not addressing the radical inequalities that existed between rich and poor in most societies in the world, generating economic growth by itself was not going to solve the basic problems of these countries, because there would still be gross inequalities in income distribution and in access to social and political power. The United States faced that in a series of revolutionary upheavals, not only in the Western Hemisphere, but in places like Vietnam. Yet, even though it was unable to either defeat the Cuban Revolution or turn the tide of battle in Vietnam, despite those apparent military limitations, American ideas of modernity, and especially the American idea of consumerism, was beginning to have a widespread effect in the world. Just as the United States was facing defeat in Vietnam, the power of its consumerist ideas was beginning to spread to virtually every society, raising serious challenges in places like the Soviet Union to communism, and creating a vast appeal for American culture around the globe, helping set the stage for the emergence in the last decades of the 20th century of a globalized economy, and some would argue a globalized culture, based in many ways on American culture that the United States had sought to spread through its mission to the world. How effectively ideas of consumerism and American culture have spread, what the reactions to them have been, because they have not been all universally receptive, we're going to see in the last phase of the course as we look at globalization around the world, which in many ways involves countries embracing American ideas about development and about modernity, and embracing American cultural ideas such as consumerism, but which has also triggered some vehement reactions, much as the earlier mission of modernization did back in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. And we'll begin to look at all that in the next session.